Hello everyone, great to see you today and thank you for two amazing presentations. So, let me move this on. Just a very few words there, but within those few words lies a really profound repurposing of what it means to be a designer. Because within those few words, it tells us that the earth is our sole beneficiary, our benefactor, our participant, and our only source of life. In the words of Ruskin, wealth is the only source of life is the only source of wealth. And what we've just heard just now about plastic is really incredibly important. But is that enough? And what actually does it mean to be a designer in the context of our times? It requires a really deep shift in our collective habits of mind, our sources of knowledge, our frames of reference, and our sense of ourselves in relation to the wider world of which we are a part. Our intuition, our ingenuity, our resources of human intelligence are actually all part of the earth too. So, are we hoping for the impossible? David Graeber's work is a great inspiration to me, and I have amazing evidence through my own work as a designer, through working with students, with designers in small businesses, through to people who work in massive global industry businesses, with researchers, with tutors, and there is amazing evidence that we can think differently. There is evidence that fashion actually is an activity that takes place at personal, intimate levels through to the pervasive global level, which means that it can help us to think about how we make things. It can help us to think about our social relationships and notions of value. And importantly, fashion creates a zeitgeist and a sense of actually what's important to us in a very visible form. And that zeitgeist can have a really profound impact, not just on what we make, but why we make it, how we make it, with whom we make it, and how we think about each other and identify ourselves in the world. So we've heard a little bit from Sian already that this making of the world in the way that we've done it based on a model of extractivism and exploitation has created an extreme act of self-harm. We're talking here not just about the stability of Earth systems, we need to talk about Earth systems justice, about a safe place in which there's a global commons for all people now and into the future. And that means more than just changing the parts of what we're doing. And again, as already been said, making society has involved already exceeding at least 7 of globally quantified safe and just boundaries out of 9. From the work of Rockstrom back in 2009, we've had a very clear idea of these boundaries already for a long time, before even thinking back to Silent Spring, 1950s, etc. But I mean, World Economic Forum is not well known for its ecological thinking, but in this simple diagram here, which is from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, you can see the interdependencies of life systems and justice. The way that we live, every element of society and how we see ourselves in the world is intertwined with climate change, biodiversity loss, and social injustice. Just one particular stat, $44 trillion worth of society is exposed through biodiversity loss. And if we're thinking about the intersectional impacts of all of this, which are basically written across the bottom of there, the situation is stark. But the good news is, it's our ways of living, our perceptions of prosperity that is actually at the heart of the problem. We can change that. Artists and designers make sense of things. We are here to create conditions for changing not just what is, but how reality is looked at and how we interpret things. We can tear down the borders of current understandings. We can explore with each other through making what it means to live well together. This is an image from, I came into academia from working as a designer. I was head of women's wear at Catherine Hamnet for a long time. And that's where I first started to realize actually how differently we could behave through acts of fashion. And fashion must, as Nicholas was saying, reduce its emissions by between 50 to 60%. And that's just emissions if we are to keep within Earth system boundaries. 50 to 60% reduction in the quantity is arresting. It's an amazing figure. We also need to be really careful. There's a lot we need to be careful about. But averages are misleading. It's the richest 20% of people who have 20 times the emissions of the poorest 20%. So that tells us who needs to do what and how. So I've worked with a lot of other people thinking about what it means to be a designer and have practice in fashion and to make sense of things. But I have to say, the more that we do this work, the more we realize just how difficult it is. The more we realize that thinking otherwise to this dominant system is something that is a very inconvenient truth for a lot of people who are in the current system. Because regeneration, reparation, and other elements of Earth systems justice involves much more than improving efficiencies. It means much more than innovations in a current system. It means intergenerational justice, intragenerational justice between countries, communities, and interspecies justice as well. So how can we as designers take this on? In the words of Gregory Bateson, we have an epistemological error, an error in our ways of knowing, our habits of mind, in many but not all parts of the world. We're torn between our current thinking that's based on a logic of volume and an ecological thinking that actually goes to the heart of what's important. And I also draw on Guattari's work around the three ecologies. And this also, I think, is where fashion is incredibly important. Because if we're thinking about the crisis at personal, societal, and biosphere level, and we think of ourselves as on a personal, societal, and biosphere level, because we are all working and operating and living at all of these levels simultaneously, then fashion is an important way to be able to recognize and act on the situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the examples of how I've been working with others over the last few years and kind of where I've got to, because there's never a static point. But I've been looking at this idea of what it means to be a designer, from coming from working as a designer in industry, this idea of creating boundary objects, creating a collection. There's all sorts of things that you can do around being a designer in that context, but it's not enough in itself. There's a lot of work around thinking about designers as co-inquirers, how we work with others, and how we can co-learn with each other, from each other, as a set of people with a shared intention. But what I think maybe I've been particularly interested in is this idea of the creator of learning objects, where the designer creates or creates the conditions where others can do the creating, or sets out ways in which to be able to invite people. The designer is host. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So when you're a designer, as a boundary object designer, you have a collection, you have things that you're asked to make, and there's only certain, but you can make lots of changes within those things. When you're thinking about a co-inquirer, it's about how you use participatory practice, how you use principles of transformation design to co-inquire with each other about the opportunities and barriers in bringing together ideas from the concept through to, here is an example of a concept that I use called shared talent, which I did in a lot of different ways, in which we reconvened using a transformative scenarios planning methodology, reconvene people across the system that don't normally get to meet each other or to understand the interdependencies, the cause and effect between their decisions. And that was one of the outcomes from one of the first projects. And then designer as host, where this is an example of a project that I've run in a number of different places, where you look at the conditions in a context, and you think about the concerns that people may have, and you invite people in to talk about those concerns, either through making or through representing themselves through photography, etc. This is something we did in Crisp Street, looking, because it's a particular area of London where there's a lot of biodiversity loss. This is an example where we did some work in the House of Lords. We took in irons and sewing machines, and we started to make things so that we could represent the concerns of different people in relation to their lives and across different age ranges as well. So in 2008, I used some of those concepts to set up Centre for Sustainable Fashion and to really set out a set of ways in which we could approach thinking about what it means to be a designer. Over time and through learning with and from and as designing what it means to contextualize our work, we've created a kind of methodology that when I get as far as being able to do good tech, I'll be able to make this into a 3D model. So the methodology is based on this idea that there are ways of being able to see the world in social, cultural, economic, and ecological lenses, and ways in which you can create prosperity across those 4 lenses. There are ways of recognizing and understanding ourselves in the world using different kind of philosophies and belief systems. Thich Nhat Hanh's into being philosophy of how we can understand ourselves as part of the other. Ubuntu, this idea of I am because you are. There's lots of ways in which we have developed this model to be ways of seeing, knowing, and doing that take us beyond the canon of fashion in its conventional form. And how do we know whether we're making any difference through our work? We've looked at transformation design, and I've taken a very simplistic way of thinking about ideas of working within a context and designing within a context, which is what the boundary object maker often does, or awareness raising does, which is really, really important, but not enough in itself. Then there's the ideation level, where we're actually thinking about the boundaries and the borders of the context in which we're in, and creating services and systems in which we can change the ways in which we interact with products. But the deep shift is something that we need to be able to find ourselves in so that we understand ourselves differently. But this deep shift is really, really difficult and very uncomfortable. It's very difficult and uncomfortable because there's so much holding on to the old systems with very good reason. All of our lives are tied up in a consumerist capitalist model that's based on volume. And for us to be able to move beyond that is very scary for a lot of people who've invested a lot of time and a lot of money and their sense of selves in this. So I've found that it's been really useful for me to draw upon Camus' work and looking at rebellion and the rebel, and to think about how we can simultaneously amplify and expand and enhance the things that we know to be progressive, to be something that is towards Earth systems justice, to be able to really work together, to be able to look at ways in which we can communicate and, in the words of Donnella Haraway, tell the stories of meaning through the way in which we are presenting ourselves. But unless we simultaneously negate and phase out the stuff that we can no longer stand and no longer sit around and be complicit in, then we will not actually be able to create a difference. Through 15 years of my work here at the university, I'm really excited and proud of all the things that I've been be involved in with lots of other people. However, in the grand scheme of things, we see that it has not dented this model of volume. As even all of the new ways in which we're thinking about fashion as resale, etc., it has not actually reduced the volume in which people are consuming. In fact, it's exacerbating it. People are doing things for all good intention, but unless we fundamentally shift our ways of seeing, knowing, and being, we're not going to be able to actually create the deep change we need. So sitting and holding that space, that intention lightly, is a really difficult but a very important place for designers to be, because we do negotiate, we do use making to be able to make sense of things. And as a university, it's an incredible role for us right now, especially as we're becoming very committed to being a social purpose university. Sitting in that tension, holding that intention, and being able to understand that we can't take a dualistic approach. The people who have different risks at different levels, for me, I work with designers or students that are really rethinking things from the start of their practice, through to people who are working in massive design companies. And the risks are different in different places. The intentions might be the same, but the risks of losing your job, who can afford to be critical when we are in a business that has given us particular demands, particular targets. So we have to think about how we can work with intention across all of those scales, and think about how we can hold it lightly but with complete conviction. Because unless we do that, we will not be true to ourselves as designers. So just to finish off, and I'm hoping I've got another minute, transforming fashion means that we've got to look at the realities of living in the Anthropocene and repurposing fashion's activities at multiple scales across regions and transforming the why as well as the how, the what, and the with whom of our practice. It's well underway, but we haven't reached the tipping point yet. And it does take all of us to be able to come into this in different ways and the multiplicity of answers that we can create. The fourfold prosperity model that I talked about earlier on does involve it producing far less clothing, shifting to regenerative agriculture, relocalizing supply chains, reparation for the opportunity lost for those who are in the system that we created through that model and will no longer necessarily have jobs in that. I spoke to people in very big businesses who recognize their responsibility. Businesses have a responsibility as we make this transition. Governments have a responsibility, and we as individuals have a responsibility to think about actually what reparation means. And it's huge, and it's difficult, but we have to do it. So biosphere rebellion involves amplification of fashion as a cultural expression. It's why I became a designer. It's what I love about fashion. The ingenuity to be able to make this viable, we need livelihoods in it. But in Earth systems justice terms, it must be the negation of the commodification of design and designing through this stimulation and volume model. Earth systems justice involves drawing on a broader canon of knowledge, the unwritten, the tacit, the indigenous, the situated, the eco-feminist, towards a justice that is in gender, race, class, geography, and environmental terms, as because all of these things are absolutely intertwined in our interbeing. It also means repurposing education. And that's what I'm also very excited about, and I could speak all day about. So through this, designing can be seen as individual and collective acts, as professionals, as citizens, but all around fundamentally questioning, disrupting, and reassembling the methods of design of our clothing and our production and consumption. But more importantly, the understanding of the ecologies within which they sit. Thank you.